hair. Other than the eyes, it's what often makes anime and stylized characters stand out a lot from each other and can be very different depending on the style. Having good hair for your characters can enhance any character illustration. After having done a head tutorial, a head variation video and eye video, it's now time to draw some hair for these bald heads, and that's what this video will be all about. I will show you a basic guide on how you can draw hair. I'll start with the basic formula and how you can apply it to different styles. Then I also mention some tips and guidelines to keep in mind for drawing good looking hair. And finally, I'll also go over some common mistakes I made. In this video, I'll really focus on the drawing part and I won't mention the coloring or painting. But if you want a video where I talk more about this, I could also make this in the future. For now, let's start with the basics, the different steps I take to draw hair. Number one would be to figure out the hairline. In my head tutorial, I already explained I have these guidelines around the head, and one of them is for the hairline. What you should keep in mind about the hairline is that the part above this hairline should be completely covered by hair unless you're drawing bald people or partially bald people, or it's the hairstyle you're going for. After figuring out the hairline, it's time to determine the hair growth spot or the hair growth line. If your character has a hairline, it's important that it's following the head sphere and is not distorted. Then before starting to draw the hair on the head, it's good to first be clear what hair shape this character in general has. So you could just draw one hair strand as an example on the side at first and really be clear if this person has more curly, wavy or straight hair this way, and if the hair ends, for example, are more blocky or triangular. You can also just break down other artist styles and find out how they draw hair shapes and use what you learned here. In general, the hair shapes can vary a lot depending on personal preference and who you're drawing, but overall, if the hair shapes are the same throughout the overall hairstyle, it should work. And now we finally start to draw the hair on the head. For this, I first like to separate the hairstyle into 3 sections. We have the bangs or the front part, then the middle or the side part, and the back part. This is also useful for breaking down other hairstyles and getting an idea of how to draw them. You're not overwhelmed by all the hair this way and can focus on one part at a time. And step 5 will then be to draw one strand or hair layer at a time. What I like to do is to draw the front and the bangs at first, then the side, and finally the back of the hair. And for the back of the hair, I really like to focus on following the silhouette of the head, and the hair should also follow the whole head sphere, but also the gravity your character is in. If there's wind around, then that can affect how the hair flows, of course. I recommend only doing rough and bigger strands at this stage. And when you've drawn in all the rough shapes, we move on to number 6, which would be to check the hair silhouette. How I like to do this is to take the hair sketch layer and fill it in with a different layer and see how it looks when the headline is completely covered by this silhouette, if the volume works. You can also then make a group with your hair silhouette layer and the hair outlines and the hair sketch layer and transform it. I often like to use the liquify tool here to really make sure it follows the head nicely. Overall, it's good to make sure that there is some volume and some distance between the head and the hair, since apart from if you want your hair to be completely flat, laying pressed down almost on the head. And this is also why I recommend only doing rough and bigger strands at the step before. When this overall volume and silhouette works, adding smaller strands and details later on works way better for me, which brings me to the final step, number 7, which is to add in more detailed strands if you want to. And at this stage, I'm also moving on to the line art, and sometimes I like to sketch in more detailed strands, but most of the time I will first do the line art and then figure out if I want to add some more hair strands. And now I'll talk about how you can apply this formula to other hairstyles and what to look out for there. What will be always the same is to figure out the general hair shape at first, and the overall hair shape as well as the smaller strands should have a similar shape language. What often happens for more wavy hair or curly hair is that 2 sides of one hair strand will be visible. So you would see parts of the front of this strand and then it would kind of be twisted and you would see the back. I'm drawing what I mean here, but you can add this in many hairstyles so the hair strands have more of a 3D-ish feeling. And when you're drawing these really curly curls, you can start out with these rounded lines and then add layers to them so you have the front and the back part. Going back to the part with the showing 2 sides of the strand, what can also really help you here for being able to draw hair strands is to draw some ribbons, and references are also very important when you want to draw some more complicated styles like braids, ponytails or buns. I look up references for this most of the time since there are different kinds of them, but you can add more details where the hair is tied up. I will also now show how I would draw braids, for example. I start out with figuring out the general flow for this, and this would also apply when I'm drawing ponytails, for example, or for longer hair in general. After I figured out this, I then move on to drawing the outlines of the braid. And for braids, the strands can be interwoven in a parallel way or also in this angled way. After I've drawn the outlines, it's time for the inner strokes, and here I often work with lots of indications and not full strokes. It's definitely good to show that the different hair strands are separate here. After the sketching phase, I then would move on to the line art and maybe add some details. But having some experience with styling hair yourself can help a lot here. But personally, I was always the one who would ask my mom or sister to braid my hair since I didn't know how to do it, so I had to learn more about this by simply looking at references that explain how the hair strands interact. And now I move on to some guidelines to keep in mind for drawing good looking hair. It's always a good idea to go from big to small, meaning just draw in rough shapes at first, and then if you want to, you can add more detail in smaller strands. If you want to draw more dynamic and flowy hair, it's good to pay attention to the pose of the character and how the gravity or movement could affect the hair, but also other forces like wind. For drawing more dynamic hair, it's good to also not have all the strands go into the same direction. For this, you can also add a few strands going into a opposite direction to make it more dynamic. Something that can help a lot with having your hair line art look nicer is to use different line weights, especially for a hair that is framing the face or where the shadows on the forehead would be, is where I would make thicker lines, but also the outer hair outline or the silhouette. I would use thinner lines for smaller strands and details. What can also help with nicer hairline art is to add more lines at the beginnings, and if you want to add the ends of the hair, this can add some more texture to it. And in general, while you're drawing hair shapes, balancing sharp and rounded shapes can really help when you're drawing hair. You don't want all the hair strands to look the same, but they should of course work together in some way. And if you want to, you can add flyaway hairs at the end, and what these are just some individual small hair strands. Most of the time they are not even line arted, so you would just have your finished illustration and then add some very small hairlines that can go in different directions to add some more detail for the hair around the face. And finally, let's move on to some tips from mistakes I made while drawing hair. First, what can often lead to flat looking hair is when the lines at the hair growth line or spot don't have volume and lay flat on it. For some hairstyles this works and it's how the whole hairstyle should look, but most of the time, especially when you're drawing wavy or curly hair, the hair will go up and then follow the direction of the head sphere. The second mistake would be that the hairlines aren't following the direction from the growth line or spot. I visualized this in the beginning when drawing the different hair strands with these arrows, and you can do this as well to help you with figuring out the directions the hair strands would fall in. Next would be that the amount of the hair strands isn't consistent throughout the hair, so it's good to just overall have an idea of how often you want to place hair strands and that it's around the same for both sides. You can also try to count the hair strands for this. The fourth mistake would be that there are many parallel or repetitive hair strands and lines. When you're drawing overlapping hair, it's important that it's clear which hair strand is in front of which and so on. And next would be to pay attention to the hair length. You might want to add details or hair ends at the top of the head, even though for your hairstyle the hair really only ends at the shoulders, for example. So in this case it wouldn't make sense to add hair ends at the top unless you're dealing with a hairstyle with lots of different lengths. It can be good to add a few strands that have differing length, but in general make sure it works for the hairstyle you're going for. Number 6 is about the volume of the hair strands, and here the hair strand should just not suddenly get more volume going downwards. It can have more volume at the top and less at the bottom if some of the hair in this hair strand is shorter. If you're using lots of different hair strands with some of them being more for details, a mistake can be to not have differing line weight, and this will just be kind of confusing to the viewers since they won't be able to tell how the hair that works. The next mistake would be to add details everywhere. It's good to have some contrast here, as I also mentioned before for the guidelines. For example, at the beginnings or the ends of the hair, adding more lines for detail makes sense. Most of the time you would also add more detail at the front part of the hair and not as much in the back. But overall it should of course be balanced. The distance between the different hair strands should not vary too much throughout the hairstyle, but you can use details to, for example, frame the face by adding more details around the face. And finally, when you're drawing multiple characters together, it's good to try to use around the same level of detail, even if they have different hairstyles. For example, I often had a problem adding more strands and details to more straight hair than for curly hair, for example. And this would be it for all the mistakes, and with that this video comes to an end, and I hope you're now able to take some of the things I mentioned in here and apply them in your own art. Thanks a lot for watching. I really hope your characters can have some amazing hair now, and have a nice day. Goodbye.